Wormwood by Mark Dawson, narrated by Gemma Whelan. Similar to Project Hail Mary, I really enjoyed the story in Wormwood, although I had problems with how it was told, both the writing and the narration. Overall, I did enjoy listening to it, but if there's a sequel, I really doubt I'd go near it. Mark Dawson's novel offers a fictionalized reimagining of the 1986 Chernobyl disaster, built around the premise that perhaps the meltdown wasn't entirely an accident. However, this detail, about the West perhaps having a hand in it, is only touched on towards the end. The main story is that in 1986, Stanislav Kalashnik, a Russian physicist working in the Chernobyl nuclear plant in the Ukrainian Soviet Socialist Republic, part of the USSR, realizes that there are safety problems with Russia's nuclear program in general and with Chernobyl in particular. He wants to get the word out to the West. In steps Eloise Shepard, a former MI6 agent who had previously tried to extract him almost 2 decades earlier, but it all went catastrophically wrong. In the interim, Eloise's life, both career and family, had gone pear-shaped. However, she is offered a chance at redemption and a way back into MI6. All she has to do is try to get him out a second time. With the KGB beginning to question Kalashnik's loyalty, the mysterious Victor Bloom recruits Shepard to re-enter the Soviet Union and bring Kalashnik back across the border. However, she's told she'll be doing this on her own, yet with help, and if it all goes wrong, the UK government will deny all knowledge. Now, it's important that you remember Bloom's name because I didn't, and at the end of the novel, 10 hours later when he's brought back in again, I had no idea who he was. He's not the only person who disappears for chapters on end, only to resurface at the denouement. Having read some reviews, it seems that Bloom is a character in the Group 15 novels, but I didn't realize this was part of that series. One of the things I disliked about the book is the many anachronisms. Some reviews I read mentioned how well Mark Dawson had done his homework, but for anyone with a passing knowledge of Cold War history, the mistakes are glaring. He has Eloise taking a flight from London to Warsaw on Aeroflot, but it would have been on LOT Polish Airlines. One of the characters gets a cup of tea that costs 6 zloty. Back in 1986, it would have cost in the region of 50 zloty. Nobody has any trouble making a phone call in this book, as if Soviet telephone exchanges worked as perfectly as they do in the West today. In a Polish restaurant in London, locals tuck into the traditional dish of poussin. Poles wouldn't have any idea what poussin was at the time. Young chickens were more readily available than larger chickens simply due to food shortages, but nobody would have chosen a small bird if they had a chance. Then there's the soup they eat. But that problem will be discussed later when I get onto the narrator. Back to the story, Eloise's entry into and journey through Poland are interesting. She is accompanied by George Lancaster, a fellow MI6 agent who is aware of her past. While Eloise is fluent in Russian and Polish, George is fluent in Ukrainian. However, I seriously doubt either is true. Poles and Russians, and I imagine Ukrainians, can detect flaws in accents a mile off. It's almost inconceivable that these people would pass off as native speakers. However, I'm getting ahead of myself here. Eloise is adopting the identity of a cellist at the Polish National Radio Orchestra or something like that, and she both checks in and picks up her cello herself. Something tells me this would be handled for the musicians. I'm trying to imagine a whole orchestra trying to get their instruments of various sizes onto and off of coaches, etc. It's at this point that another name is mentioned, as he kills the poor Polish cellist. However, he's not mentioned again until the very end, and again I was wondering who the hell this was and what part he played. Travelling from Warsaw to Ukraine seems almost too easy. There's no hint of the difficulties they would have faced getting onto the train or crossing the border. Almost nothing about the documents required, no searching of their personal items for contraband. It's just so inconceivable. The slow build towards the Chernobyl disaster is genuinely tense, as we now have 2 parallel stories. Eloise and George have to try to make contact with Kalashnik while he has problems of his own. The Soviets have decided that now is the time to conduct an experiment to see how the reactor would cope with a drop in power. Kalashnik is the only one who can predict a problem, and it gives a good insight into the power of the Soviet apparatus at the time. However, here is where some reviewers had a problem, although it wasn't for me. One reviewer felt it was disrespectful to use Chernobyl as a backdrop for a fictional story due to the number of people who were killed as a result, as if literature and cinema aren't full of fictionalized stories about World War II. Another reviewer mentioned the lack of detail to the explosion, expecting this novel to be an accurate historical representation of what went wrong. In the world of the novel, I have no problem suspending belief for events like this. I do have a problem, however, with poor research. I also have a problem with the pacing in this novel. There's lots described that is simply unnecessary. Want to know how to cook roast chicken? He's got you covered. Unsure how to make baked beans? This is your book. I didn't have a problem with the technical details within the power plant, although I did find some of the descriptions about the plant in general dull.
The vast white shape of the power station and its candy cane-striped ventilation stack started to appear over the tops of the trees that separated it from the town. They drove beneath the enormous power masts that carried the high-tension power cables to the switching stations, enabling the tens of thousands of volts that passed along them to be fed into the Ukrainian grid. Stanislavovich turned onto the main access road. The facility was surrounded by a wire mesh fence. The road ran directly to a guardhouse that had been built next to a gate.
To be honest, I also had a problem with the characters. Eloise Shepherd would slot in perfectly into the Slow Horses series. She's just competent enough to have made it through MI5 training, but incompetent enough to be absolutely useless. This is evidenced both by her first extraction attempt and back in 1986, when the mission is over and she's back in London. She left her gun behind and then opens the door to an assassin she had already been warned about. Why? While I enjoyed the story as a whole, I felt it was let down both by the writing and the narrator. In fact, I began to wonder if this was perhaps Dawson's first novel, published long after the fact and once he had established himself. The writing is very weak in places. He did this, then he did this, then he did this, then he did this. There's no change in tenses or structure. It's not just once this happens, it's throughout the novel, and it does become noticeable. The narrator was similarly mediocre. They obviously hired her because of her quite decent French accent. Unfortunately, only about 2 minutes of the runtime takes place in Paris. The rest is mostly in Ukraine or Poland, with Polish, Ukrainian and Russian accents required. It's a shame that she can only do vaguely foreign.
You think Kalashnik is going to be trouble? Probably not, but it's not him I'm worried about.
There are lots of mispronunciations of words, not just in Polish, Ukrainian and Russian, but English too. She is unable to say demur. It sort of comes across as close to demure, but not quite that either. And it is mentioned at least twice in the novel, so it tells you a lot about Dawson's variety of language in the book. Scottish place names are stabs in the dark.
She had arrived in Invergordon and had moved around Moray Firth and Cromarty Firth, staying in each place for only a night or two before moving somewhere else.
The soup in the restaurant in London she pronounces as a weird barszcza, hitting neither the English nor the Polish pronunciation on the head. The cellist is pronounced Agnieszka instead of Agnieszka, and Władysław is pronounced as Władysław. Kiev is pronounced multiple ways. Mostly I found her delivery simply flat. The sentences were all pronounced in the same way with little inflection. What her delivery actually brought to mind was Kate Adie reporting from a war zone.
The scale of the devastation difficult to comprehend. Smoke drifted out of the space where the roof had once been, and, like ants labouring on a hill, he saw the firemen working on dousing the flames. Stanislavovich's body floated face down just a few feet away from them, slowly rotating as it drifted away from the shore. Tereshchenko strode out into the water, dragging Kostin with him. Kostin's heels left shallow trenches in the mud. They went out until the water was up to Tereshchenko's waist.
There was no tension, merely a statement of fact, and that's not what I want from a thriller. A better narrator, I'm thinking David Thorpe, could really have injected a lot more into this. She was adequate for this adequate novel is the highest praise I can give. This is the third Mark Dawson novel that has disappointed me after The Cleaner and the House in the Woods. I'm beginning to think that the short stories that introduced me to Dawson, including Scorpion, Witness X, The Vault and Little Sister, were a fluke. That said, looking back at my reviews, I wasn't too happy with 2 of those short stories. In fact, another excellent short story, Tarantula, led me to the awful The Cleaner, so maybe I need to reappraise what I think of Mark Dawson. If you're wondering what Wormwood refers to, it's the name of a secret US government group that organized the accident at the power plant and the exfiltration of Kalashnik. And this word apparently is also the English translation of Chernobyl. Every day's a school day. Would I listen to another audiobook written by Mark Dawson? I really don't know. Would I listen to another audiobook narrated by Gemma Whelan? Probably not. Overall, I'd give the book a 3 out of 5 and the narrator a 3 out of 5 as well. How about you? Have you listened to this or any other novel by Mark Dawson? What did you think? Who are your favourite narrators? Let me know in the comments below. Don't forget to like and subscribe as I release a new review every week. Thanks for watching.